My husband signed a lease on an apartment 14 months before he ever mentioned the word divorce to me. I found the paperwork by accident, tucked behind a stack of old tax returns in a box he thought I'd never open. My hands went cold before my brain even finished reading the date. 14 months, while I was picking out paint colors for our kitchen, while I was planning his 40th birthday party, while I was pregnant with the idea that we were building something together, he was already renting a life without me. My name is Elena Marsh. I'm 38 years old, an architect at a firm in Portland, Oregon, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed my marriage was simply going through a rough patch. Tired, distant, busy. I had explanations for everything. I didn't have an explanation for a signed 12-month lease with his name on it, and a start date that was 14 months in the past. I sat on the floor of our garage with that paper in my lap and my daughter's old bicycle leaning against my shoulder, and I felt something inside me go very quiet. Not sad yet, just quiet. The kind of quiet before a storm decides which direction it's going to travel. I didn't confront him that night. I folded the lease agreement, photographed every page with my phone, and put it back exactly where I found it, corner for corner, dust for dust. If Daniel had been planning something for over a year, I decided I could plan something too. Daniel and I met when I was 26, fresh out of grad school, drawing blueprints for buildings I'd never get credit for. He was already in wealth management then. Charming in that easy way men are charming when they've never had to work very hard to be liked. He proposed on a bridge overlooking the Willamette River, and I remember thinking that I had never felt so certain of anything in my life. 12 years, 1 daughter, and 1 mortgage later, certainty is a strange thing to lose without noticing. We built a life the way most couples do in small, unremarkable increments. A starter condo, then a house with a yard big enough for a swing set. Daniel climbing the ladder at his firm, taking clients to dinner, coming home smelling like other people's cigars. I made partner track at my firm the same year Mia was born, and for a while, we were the couple other people pointed to, the one that had figured it out. Looking back, I think that reputation became its own kind of trap. We were so busy being the couple everyone admired that neither of us noticed when the admiration became a performance instead of a description. I used to tell myself that marriages have seasons. Some years are for passion, some for survival, some for quiet maintenance. I told myself we were simply in a maintenance season, the kind every long marriage passes through. I didn't know that while I was maintaining, Daniel was already drafting blueprints of his own ones that didn't include me in the final structure. The signs looking back were small enough to explain away. He started taking calls in the garage. He renewed his gym membership at a location 20 minutes farther from our house. He began referring to some restructuring at work that never seemed to resolve into anything specific. When I asked, he'd smile and say, "You worry too much, Elle. It's just work stuff." I believed him because believing him was easier than the alternative. Then came the courier mistake. A legal courier delivered a thick manila envelope to our house addressed to Daniel, and because I was the one who signed for packages, I was the one who opened it before realizing it wasn't for me to open. Inside was a draft postnuptial agreement, not a rough sketch. A polished, lawyer-reviewed document dated 11 months earlier, outlining exactly how our assets would be divided if we ever separated. My husband hadn't stumbled into thinking about divorce. He had commissioned it. I remember standing in our foyer holding that envelope, listening to our daughter Mia laugh at something on the television in the next room and thinking, he built an exit ramp for himself before he ever told me the road was ending. I am not a woman who screams. I am a woman who researches. The next morning, after Daniel left for work and Mia left for school, I sat down at my drafting table, the same one where I design buildings, meant to stand for 100 years, and I began building something else, a timeline. I pulled bank statements going back 2 years. I cross-referenced credit card charges. I found a storage unit rental Daniel had never mentioned, paid in cash, opened the same month as the apartment lease. I found a life insurance policy update that had quietly removed me as sole beneficiary and added a trust I didn't recognize. Every discovery was another brick in a wall I hadn't known was being built around me. The apartment, the post-nup draft, the storage unit, the beneficiary change. 4 separate, deliberate decisions, each one made while Daniel came home every night, kissed me on the forehead, and asked what was for dinner. I called my closest friend Priya, a family law paralegal I'd known since college. I told her everything, laying the documents across her kitchen table like evidence at a trial, because that's exactly what they were. She read through them slowly, her expression sharpening with each page. Finally, she looked up at me and said, "Elena, this isn't a man who fell out of love. This is a man who planned an exit strategy and kept living inside the marriage because it was convenient." I didn't cry. I remember being surprised by that. I just nodded because some part of me had already known. "What do I do?" I asked her. She tapped the postnup draft. "You don't sign anything, and you don't say a word to him yet. Not until you understand exactly what he's hidden and how much of it he thinks you'll never find." For the next 6 weeks, I lived 2 lives. In one life, I was Elena, the wife, packing lunches, attending Mia's soccer games, sitting across from Daniel at dinner while he talked about a promotion he was still waiting to hear about. I laughed at his jokes. I let him kiss me goodnight. I became, without ever having auditioned for the role, a very convincing actress. In the other life, I was building a case. Priya connected me with a forensic accountant named Robert Chen, a quiet, meticulous man who looked at spreadsheets the way I looked at architectural drawings, searching for the load-bearing lies holding the whole structure together. Robert found what I couldn't. A shell account opened under an LLC bearing Daniel's mother's maiden name. Transfers totaling nearly $200,000 siphoned out of our joint investments in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic flags over a period of 16 months. "He's been doing this since before you two even discussed problems in the marriage," Robert told me, sliding a printed report across his desk. "This isn't a man reacting to a failing relationship. This is premeditation." That word sat heavy in my chest. Premeditation, like something out of a courtroom drama, except the courtroom was my kitchen and the crime scene was our bed. I asked Robert the question I'd been afraid to ask anyone. "Do you think he ever loved me at all?" Robert set down his pen, and for a moment the meticulous accountant disappeared, and just a kind man remained. "I can't answer that, Elena, but I can tell you that the man who opened this account 16 months ago was already living for someone else's future. Whatever love existed before that, it stopped being enough to keep him honest." I drove home that afternoon with the windows down, letting the cold air hit my face so I wouldn't have to think too hard about how steady my hands were on the wheel. I had expected to fall apart. Instead, I felt something colder and more useful settling into place. The same feeling I get when a building design has a flaw, and I finally understand exactly where the crack started. I still remember the night I found out who else was involved. Her name was Vanessa Cole. She was Daniel's business partner's wife. I found her name attached to the shell LLC as a co-signer, buried in paperwork Robert had traced through 3 different filings. My stomach turned in a way I hadn't expected. Not just betrayal by my husband, betrayal woven into the fabric of people I'd hosted for dinner, people who had sat at my table and told me how lucky Daniel was to have me. I confirmed it 2 days later when I saw a text notification light up Daniel's phone while he was in the shower. I wasn't proud of looking. I wasn't ashamed either. Not anymore. The message read, "Can't wait until this is finally over and we don't have to hide anymore." Over. As if our marriage were a countdown clock he was waiting to hit 0. I sat on the edge of our bed, phone screen glowing in my hand, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I let myself feel the full weight of it. Not confusion, not shock, grief, the kind that comes from realizing the man sleeping 12 feet away from you, in the shower, humming some tune under his breath, had been quietly erasing you from his future for over a year while asking what you wanted for your anniversary. I didn't confront him that night either. Instead, I called Priya and said 4 words. "I'm ready to move." The next morning, I met with a divorce attorney named Marguerite Hale, a woman with silver-streaked hair and the calm precision of someone who had watched 1,000 marriages end and never once flinched. I laid everything on her desk. The lease, the postnup draft, the Shell LLC, the beneficiary change, Robert's forensic report, the text message, screenshotted and backed up in 3 separate places. Marguerite read through it methodically, occasionally making a small sound of acknowledgement, the kind of sound you make when a puzzle piece slides perfectly into place. "Mrs. Marsh," she finally said, "your husband made a critical mistake. He assumed you wouldn't look. Men like this always assume that." "What does this mean for me?" I asked. "It means that instead of a fair 50-50 split, we're likely looking at a court recognizing deliberate financial concealment and dissipation of marital assets. Oregon courts do not look kindly on spouses who quietly drain joint accounts to fund a secret life. This shell account, this postnup he never had the courage to actually present to you, it works entirely in your favor." For the first time in weeks, something loosened in my chest. Not happiness. Not yet. But the feeling of a door opening in a hallway I thought had no exits. "There's something else," Marguerite added, tapping the LLC paperwork. "Vanessa Cole's husband, Richard, is your husband's business partner. If Richard doesn't know about this financial arrangement, and given how carefully it was hidden, I doubt he does, that's going to become his problem too. I hadn't considered that. I hadn't considered that my quiet, careful documentation could ripple out and touch a life I'd never even thought to include in the blast radius." "Do you want that?" Marguerite asked, watching my face carefully. I thought about it for a long moment. Then I said, "I don't want revenge. I want the truth to exist somewhere it can't be erased." We filed on a Tuesday. Daniel came home that evening to find Marguerite's process server waiting on our porch. I watched from the kitchen window as his face moved through disbelief, then anger, then something that looked almost like fear once he understood the size of the envelope in his hands. He came inside holding the papers like they might detonate. "Elena, what is this?" "You know exactly what that is," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "We can talk about this. Whatever's going on, we can fix it." "For how long, Daniel?" I asked. "How long have you been planning your exit? The apartment lease was signed 14 months ago. The postnup draft is 11 months old. The Shell account with Vanessa's name on it goes back 16 months. So please tell me exactly which conversation you think we still need to have." His face drained of color. I watched him try to construct a lie, watched the gears turn behind his eyes, searching for an explanation that could survive contact with the paperwork now shaking slightly in his hands. He found none. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he finally said quietly, as if that was any kind of answer at all. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't supposed to be discovered. There's a difference." The months that followed were not easy. There is no version of unraveling 12 years of a shared life that doesn't hurt. I moved through phases I didn't have names for, until I lived them: the humiliation of friends learning the truth, the isolation of realizing how many people had known and said nothing, the strange grief of mourning a marriage that had already been dead for over a year without my knowledge. Word travels fast in a city the size of Portland, especially among the small, tangled circle of finance and architecture professionals we'd built our social life around. I found out from a mutual friend that at least 2 couples had suspected something for months but said nothing, not wanting to get involved. My own mother, when I told her, went quiet on the phone for a long moment before saying, "I always thought he looked at you like you were a line item, not a person." I hadn't expected that kind of clarity from her, and it broke something open in me that I hadn't realized was still sealed shut. There were nights I sat in Mia's doorway after she'd fallen asleep, just watching her breathe, wondering how I had missed 14 months of quiet betrayal happening in the same house where I'd tucked her in every single night, wondering what else I hadn't seen. It is a particular kind of loneliness, realizing that the person who was supposed to be your witness to life had spent over a year turning himself into a stranger while sleeping beside you. But isolation, I learned, is not the same as weakness. Priya showed up some evenings with takeout and no questions, just sitting with me while I stared at forensic reports until the numbers blurred. Robert sent updates late at night, methodical and calm, never once treating my pain as something separate from his job. Marguerite called after hours more than once, not billing the time, just checking whether I was still standing. I was, barely some days, but I was. Mia asked me once, sitting on her bed with her knees pulled to her chest, why Daddy didn't live with us anymore. I told her the truth in the gentlest words I could find, that sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt other people, and that it was never, ever her fault. She nodded slowly, the way children do when they understand more than they can articulate, and asked, "Are you going to be okay, Mom?" "I am," I told her, and for the first time, I believed it. 3 weeks into the discovery process, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. "Elena, this is Richard Cole." His voice was tight, careful, like a man walking across ice he wasn't sure would hold his weight. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. "Richard, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me," he said. "Is my wife's name on financial documents connected to your divorce case?" I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to protect him from what was coming, the same way I wish someone had protected me a year earlier. But I had promised myself, sitting in Marguerite's office months before, that I was done protecting people who had chosen deception over honesty. "Yes," I said quietly. "Vanessa's name is on a Shell LLC tied to funds moved out of my marriage. You should talk to a lawyer of your own, Richard, soon." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, barely above a whisper, "I already knew something was wrong. I just didn't want to know what." I understood that sentence more than he could have realized. I'd lived inside it for over a year myself. The discovery process and the divorce proceedings did exactly what Marguerite predicted. Daniel's attorney tried to argue the Shell LLC was a legitimate business investment, unrelated to the marriage. Robert's forensic report dismantled that argument in 11 pages of documented transfers, timestamps, and account trails that left no room for interpretation. Richard Cole, Daniel's business partner, filed for his own divorce 4 months later. I never spoke to him directly, but Priya heard through mutual connections that the discovery of his wife's involvement in the Shell account had shattered more than one relationship at once. I felt no satisfaction in that, only the quiet, sad recognition that dishonesty rarely stays contained to the people who choose it. On the day of the final hearing, I sat beside Marguerite in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and stronger coffee than anyone should drink before 9 in the morning. Daniel sat across the aisle with his attorney, a sharp-suited man who kept glancing at the exhibit binder as though hoping it might rearrange itself in his client's favor. Judge Alvarez, a woman with reading glasses perched low on her nose and a reputation for not tolerating theatrics, moved through the exhibits methodically. When she reached the Shell LLC documentation, she paused, looked up over her glasses, and asked Daniel's attorney directly, "Counsel, can you explain to me why funds were moved into an account co-signed by a woman who is not a party to this marriage beginning 16 months prior to the filing date?" His attorney fumbled through a response about diversified investment strategy. Judge Alvarez did not look convinced. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. "Mr. Marsh," she said, addressing Daniel directly, "financial misconduct in a marriage isn't measured only by what was taken. It's measured by intent. And the timeline in front of me shows clear, sustained intent to conceal assets from your spouse for well over a year before you ever informed her a divorce was coming." I watched Daniel's jaw tighten, the same way it used to when he lost an argument he thought he'd already won. In the final settlement, the court ruled that Daniel's deliberate concealment and diversion of marital assets constituted financial misconduct. I was awarded 65% of our shared assets, full ownership of the house, and primary custody of Mia. Daniel's carefully built exit ramp had cost him far more than the marriage he'd tried to quietly leave. He looked smaller in that courtroom than I had ever seen him. Not because the judge raised her voice, she never did, but because the version of himself he'd spent a year constructing, the confident man with a secret plan and a secret account and a secret relationship, had finally run out of places to hide. Outside on the courthouse steps, he caught up to me before I reached my car. "I hope you're happy," he said, and there was no venom in it, only exhaustion. "I'm not looking for happy yet," I told him. "I'm looking for honest. And for the first time in over a year, everything about this is finally honest." He didn't have anything to say to that. I didn't wait for him to find something. I didn't celebrate the day the settlement was finalized. I drove home, picked Mia up from school, and we made pasta together in our kitchen, my kitchen now, fully and legally, while she told me about a science project involving volcanoes and baking soda. Later that night, after she was asleep, I sat on our back porch with a cup of tea, looking out at the yard I'd designed myself years ago, back when I still believed permanence was something you could build with enough care. I thought about the 14 months, about the lease, the postnup, the shell account, the quiet architecture of a marriage's ending that Daniel had constructed brick by brick while I was still trying to repair the walls. I thought, too, about Richard Cole, who called me 2 months later to say his own divorce had finalized, and that, strangely, he wanted to thank me for telling him the truth when I didn't have to. "You didn't owe me anything," he said, "but you gave it to me anyway." I hadn't done it for him. I'd done it because I was done letting silence protect people who didn't deserve protecting. But I was glad, in some quiet way, that honesty had rippled outward instead of staying contained to just my own life. Priya asked me once over wine on this same porch whether I regretted not confronting Daniel the very night I found the lease in the garage. I told her no. If I had confronted him that night out of shock and hurt, he would have had time to cover his tracks, to move money faster, to construct a new set of lies to replace the ones I'd found. Patience wasn't weakness. Patience was the only thing that let the truth survive long enough to matter in a courtroom. I realized something sitting there in the cool evening air. Daniel hadn't lost the marriage because I found the paperwork. He'd lost it the moment he decided secrecy was easier than honesty, the moment he chose to plan an escape instead of asking for a conversation, 14 months before he ever had the courage to say the word divorce out loud. I didn't need revenge to feel whole again. I needed the truth, laid out clearly enough that no one, including Daniel, could pretend it hadn't happened. The court records would exist long after the two of us stopped thinking about each other daily. The timeline I built on my drafting table, the same table where I designed buildings meant to outlast me, had outlasted the marriage instead, a permanent record of exactly who had been honest and exactly who had not. Mia's laughter from her science project still echoed somewhere in my chest as I finished my tea. Outside, the Portland sky was turning that soft shade of blue it takes on right before nightfall, the kind of color that looks like an ending and a beginning at exactly the same time. Mia came out onto the porch a few minutes later, unable to sleep, and climbed into the chair beside mine without a word. We sat together in the quiet, watching the last light fade behind the tree line, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in over a year. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of ground beneath my feet. "Mom," she said softly, "do you think Dad knows he messed up?" I thought about the courthouse steps, about the exhaustion in Daniel's voice, and about the version of him that had spent 14 months building a life he thought I'd never uncover. "I think he's starting to," I said. "But whether he really understands it or not, sweetheart, isn't something I need to carry anymore. That's his weight to hold now, not mine." She nodded, satisfied in the simple way children are satisfied by simple truths, and rested her head against my shoulder. For the first time in over a year, I finally understood which one I was standing in.